Hi, my name is Brian Baker. I'm the Director of Conservation and Research at Los Padres Forest Watch, and I'm excited to talk to you about trees today. We have a lot of tree species in the Los Padres National Forest, a great diversity of them, and I'm going to try to cover as many as I can. First, I just want to say that you can find a lot of really wonderful books in our online store, store.forestwatch.org. A lot of these pertain to trees of this region and other plants, of course. So please check that out. All the proceeds that we get from book sales go right back to our conservation efforts in the Los Padres National Forest and other public lands in the region. So when we look at the Los Padres, when we look at the number of different tree species that occur there, by our count, there are at least 63 native tree species in the national forest. And there are, of course, there's some gray area between some species, whether or not they should be classified more as a shrub or more as a tree. But we're not too worried about that. We have included species that can be a small tree or a large tree. Some species may often occur as a shrub, but regardless, our count is about 63 species. And if you look at the families, so there are a lot of families that are represented in the Los Padres National Forest. The ones that have the highest number of species are the beech family, the pine family, the willow family, the rose family. Those have a lot of diversity within the Los Padres National Forest. And we break this down into genus. So this is a step below family in taxonomy. You'll see that the genus that has the most species compared to any other genus is Quercus, which is the oak genus, followed by Pinus, which of course is the pines, and the willow genus, Salix there. Now, the Los Padres National Forest is interesting among national forests in California. It is, along with the other forest in Southern California, not very forested, actually. It's about 72% shrubland. Most of that is chaparral and coastal sage scrub. And so you see that here in this green and kind of this purplish, pinkish color. That is all chaparral and coastal sage scrub. Where you see this darker green and some red and brown, that is where you actually start getting into tree-dominated ecosystems like conifer forest, oak woodlands, and some ecosystems that are a little bit mixed between hardwoods and conifers. I want to talk about conifers first. This is a very diverse group of trees in the Los Padres National Forest, and it's one of the ones that I think people struggle with the most. And so I want to try to give you the tools to be able to identify different conifers from each other when you're out on the trail in the Los Padres. So we can break the conifers down into three large groups. The pines, we can break conifers down into four large groups, three of which are in this one family called the pine family. Those are the pines, the true firs, and the Douglas firs. We don't have any true spruces in the Los Padres National Forest, so we're not going to worry about spruces, but these are all somewhat closely related, and they're actually pretty easy to tell apart once you start learning some tips and tricks here. You'll notice that with these species, they do have these cones that are usually pretty large and obvious. And there are some key differences between pines and Douglas firs and true firs in terms of their cone structure, also their leaf structure. Those are going to be really key for identifying them. And they differ quite a bit, though, from this other group of conifers that are in the cypress family. So this is the other big family that is represented among the conifers in Los Padres National Forest. These include really cool species like the incense cedar. This is Sargent cypress, which is kind of a rare tree species in the Los Padres, only found up near San Luis Obispo. And then this is California juniper. I'm not going to talk much about the cypress family. It is not nearly as abundant as the other species that I'm going to talk about, which are in the pine family. I will mention a couple of things here and there, but just this is maybe for another webinar down the road. So there are 16 species of conifers that are native to the Los Padres National Forest. A lot of those are pines. They are in the pine genus, Pinus. There are a couple of true firs, and I'm only going to talk about one of those really in depth. The Santa Lucia fir is fascinating, and I will mention it, but it's very rare. And then there's Douglas fir, and those are all, again, in the same family. So they're all somewhat closely related to each other, much more closely related to each other than to any of the members of the cypress family, which includes really well-known trees like the coast redwood. But the coast redwood really only occurs up in the Monterey Ranger District, along the coast, up in that really northern part of the Los Padres National Forest. So I'm not going to talk much about that. That's a very well-known tree, and I don't think people need a lot of help identifying it. I want to start, though, I want to get in depth with some of these pine species. And one of the things that's really useful for being able to differentiate pines is first to know where you are, right? There are some elevational differences between some of these pine species. For example, limber pine, which I'm not going to go in depth on because you can only find it in two spots in the Los Padres National Forest. At the top of Mount Pinos, or Mount Pinos as locals call it, and at the top of the neighboring mountain, Sawmill Mountain. Both of those are above 8,000 feet in elevation, and limber pine is truly a high elevation species. It's really more of a subalpine pine in a lot of ways, and so you cannot find it down lower, mixing in with like the mixed conifer forest or even lower elevation forest. You again will only see it at the top of those summits. There are other pines, though, that occur also at relatively high elevation for the Los Padres National Forest. Sugar pine, Jeffrey pine, Ponderosa pine, you will often see those together on higher elevation mountains, kind of like Pine Mountain Ridge, for example, is a great place where you can see all three of those species occurring together. And I'm going to talk a lot about how to differentiate them. And if you go to lower and mid elevations, you'll see interesting species like Coulter pine, knobcone pine, gray pine. Those are all pines that tend to occur more so with chaparral than with other conifers. They're a really kind of an odd group of pines, but they're great to know, and they're pretty easy to find, at least the Coulter pine and the gray pine, not so much the knobcone pine in the Los Padres National Forest. And the gray pine is the one that occurs at the lowest elevation of any of these pines. The single-leaf pinyon pine is very easy to see. It is very abundant, but only in this one a fairly large area of the Los Padres National Forest. That's mostly the Mount Pinos Ranger District, and it's at mid elevations. Now, if you know where you are, then that can help you narrow down pretty quickly what sort of pines you're looking at. You can then use this other trick, which can help you narrow it down a little bit more, which is looking at the number of leaves in a bundle. So leaves occur in what are called fascicles on pines. They're basically little bundles. They have this kind of membranous sheath around the base of the leaves where they attach to the stem. And all pines have bundles. There is one pine in the world called the single-leaf pinyon pine, which we have here in the Los Padres, that does not have more than one leaf in a bundle. It's still technically called a bundle, but this is very unique. So if you only find one leaf and it's got all these other characteristics of a pine, then what you're looking at is a single-leaf pinyon pine. But you'll notice a lot of them have 3 leaves in a bundle. And so you have to use some other ways to identify those to try to differentiate them. But those are pretty easy to tell apart from the 5-needle pines like sugar pine and limber pine. So let's start with Coulter pine. Again, this is one of those kind of mid-elevation species. You tend to see it in chaparral-dominated areas. It has 3 leaves in a bundle. It has the largest seed cones of any pine in the world, very, very large cones. And you only find it in the southern Los Padres National Forest. You find it mostly in the southern Los Padres National Forest. You can find it in the Monterey Ranger District if you're going north up towards Big Sur, but it tends to be on the inland area of that district. So not necessarily right next to Big Sur, but a little bit more into the mountains. One of the key characteristics of Coulter pine, besides the fact that it has these massive cones, is that it has really, really long leaves as well, much longer than, say, Jeffrey pine or Ponderosa pine. And if you are looking at one with cones on it, you may notice that the cones are tightly closed. And so you will see there is variability in populations of what we call serotiny, which is this tendency for cones to stay closed until they get opened up by some disturbance. Usually it's heat from a fire. That's what actually opens up the cones. It causes them to open and release their seeds. But some populations, you'll see that they have cones that stay tightly closed in the tree for many, many years, while others you'll see that they open their cones on the tree without fire, you can find these big open cones in the ground. And again, they are really, really large. This is not even the largest that they can be, but this is a pretty good sized cone. Where you will find Coulter pine is, we're going to focus on the southern Los Padres. For these, you're going to see some maps of where you could find some of these trees, and we're going to really focus on this portion of the Los Padres National Forest, not really the Monterey Ranger District. But you can find Coulter pine in the Santa Barbara front country at the highest elevations in that area, like La Cumbre Peak, for example. You can find it around Figueroa Mountain. There's quite a bit of Coulter pine in the Figueroa Mountain area, and kind of going into the San Rafael Wilderness a little bit. And one of the best places is up in the La Panza Range, up in the Machesna Mountain Wilderness area. And you can also find it along Cuesta Ridge, both West Cuesta and East Cuesta Ridge near San Luis Obispo. One of my favorite places in the Santa Barbara front country to see this species is along what some people call Piney Ridge, or I think there's several names. The Rock Garden is probably the most common name for it. A really cool place where you can see this species. And yeah, it's just some gorgeous views, and it's the only pine that you'll find on this ridge. So one of the best places in the Los Padres National Forest to see Coulter pines is in the Machesna Mountain Wilderness in the La Panza Range. This is a really cool area. You can see these pretty big stands of Coulter pine, and a lot of these actually developed in response to a wildfire that occurred here in 1994. It caused a lot of new growth for this species in this area. And you can see this where, again, there are populations that have those cones that are tightly closed until they get heated up from a fire, and then that causes them to release all of these seeds that they've been sort of storing for many years. And so you'll see these pretty dense stands come up after fire, and then those will naturally start to sort of self-thin and start building up that seed bank again in the canopy. And then the next fire will come through and it'll start that process all over again. So this is sort of the natural fire pattern for this species in this area. Now, there is a very similar species in that it occurs around the same elevations, and it can look kind of similar from a distance especially, and that is the gray pine. This also has 3 leaves in a bundle, and they are very, very, very long. So they're even longer than Coulter pine, and I think they're longer than Coulter pine. I'll have to double check that. But they're very long. They're certainly longer than Jeffrey pine and Ponderosa pine and the 5-needle pines as well. And they are found at some of the lowest elevations in terms of pines for the Los Padres National Forest. There are other pines in California that you can find at even lower elevations, like along the coast. There are some coastal pines like Bishop pine, but we don't have those in the Los Padres. And so you'll see these in the foothills, and they're usually with chaparral, or they're kind of part of these oak woodlands that are at these elevations. You can find it in both the southern Los Padres National Forest and up in the Monterey Ranger District. So can look a little bit like Coulter Pine from a distance. They have quite large cones. Their cones are a little bit smaller than Coulter's, and they tend to be a little bit rounder, a little squatter, not quite as elongated. But one of the things that you'll notice is that their cones, no matter what population you're looking at, they don't stay closed on the tree for years. Once they are finished developing, they will open up and release their seeds. You will also notice that some of the older gray pines will tend to have forked trunks. So you'll see this is a very characteristic gray pine. This is super common to see this. So that distinguishes it from a lot of other pines. The Coulter pine, you really don't see them have forked trunks like this. They're pretty straight and single trunked. And that's the same for the other three-needle pines that you might find at higher elevations like Jeffrey pine and Ponderosa pine. But yeah, this one very often it's forked. The trunk is forked. Now, really, the only places that you will find this in the southern Los Padres are in the Figueroa Mountain area, and up in that same sort of region where I was talking about the Coulter pines up in the La Panza range, but also on East Cuesta Ridge, that area. So you can find them up in San Luis Obispo County and in Santa Barbara County, but they don't really occur in Ventura County, which is interesting. Figueroa Mountain area, probably the best place to go and see gray pines in the Los Padres. Very accessible, easy to see. And this is along a trail. This is, I don't remember which trail this is, but it's on the north side of Figueroa Mountain. It might be White Rock Trail. It's one of those trails. And so you're seeing some lovely gray pines here. And you'll notice they have this quality to them where when the light hits them, especially when it's kind of backlighting them, they sort of, they're kind of ethereal. They're a little bit see-through. They're sort of transparent. They kind of have this silvery color to them. This is why they're called gray pines. They're not like super dark green. One of their other names is actually ghost pine for this reason. So it's a really lovely thing to see in this time of day. There's actually another conifer that you can see back there, which we'll talk about. That's Bigcone Douglas-fir, but we're not quite there yet. And oh yeah, Rinconada Trail. This is a great place to see a lot of gray pines actually kind of occurring in almost like a stand, which you don't often see. You usually see them scattered in chaparral, but this area, they're all pretty close together. And again, notice that most of these have these forked trunks, which again sets it apart from a lot of other species. Now, if you go to higher elevations, and really, this is only in Santa Barbara County and Ventura County, this is where you're going to see this species, but you got to go up higher than where you will find gray pine or even Coulter pine. You'll run into Jeffrey pine. Now, this is a really common species in Southern California at higher elevations and in the Southern Sierra Nevada, and especially on the east side of the Sierra Nevada. This is a very similar species to Ponderosa pine, which is much more common across most of the Western United States, Northern California, Oregon, Eastern Washington, Colorado, the Rockies, especially the Southern Rockies and the Southwest. In general, that's where you'll find a lot of Ponderosa pine. Jeffrey pine is sort of our Southern California version of that species, and they're very, very similar. I'm actually not going to talk much about Ponderosa pine, mainly because Jeffrey pine is so much more common in the Los Padres than Ponderosa. So most of the time when you're seeing a tree that could be Jeffrey or Ponderosa, it's probably a Jeffrey pine. But I will show you some things to look for. It has 3 leaves in a bundle. They're not nearly as long as those leaves of the Coulter pine or the gray pine. And their cones are, while fairly large, are still smaller than gray pines and Coulter pines. And again, you can only find this in the Southern Los Padres National Forest. Now, one thing to notice is that the cones have that really classic pine cone look to them. They just look like what you would think of when you think of a pine cone. They are smaller than Coulter pines and gray pine cones. They do not stay closed on the tree, so they will open up and release their seeds. But they are larger than Ponderosa cones. They tend to be almost like twice as large as Ponderosa cones. So that's one way to tell them apart. But again, don't worry too much about trying to differentiate Jeffrey and Ponderosa in the Los Padres, because most of the time you're looking at a Jeffrey pine. And yeah, they have longer leaves than sugar pine, for example, but shorter than Coulter or gray pines. This is a really beautiful tree that you will, it's hard not to appreciate it. And one thing that you will notice, especially on older Jeffrey pines, they don't have a lot of branches on those, the lower half or the lower third of the tree. So they tend to go through kind of a self pruning process. It could be from a mixture of a combination of fire, but also they just tend to lose branches at their lower down in the tree as they get older. So they tend to be a little top heavy. You will see on a lot of the big old ones, because of like lightning strikes, just because they've been around for a long time, they will have kind of this flat top. It's basically where they've lost it's lost like the top of the tree. And so it didn't really regrow straight. It just kind of grew these big branches out. So you will see that quite a bit. And the other thing I wanted to mention is they have this kind of reddish orangish bark that has these big sort of armor-like plates. The bark, it's thick. It almost looks like, yeah, plates of armor. And I think I've got a better photo coming up. Now you can find this in Santa Barbara County only in the Big Pine Mountain area. So that's where you'll see some Jeffrey pines. So that's pretty deep into the wilderness, in the San Rafael wilderness and the Dick Smith wilderness. Where you can find it much easier is on Pine Mountain Ridge, Alamo Mountain, all across Mount Pinos, Fraser Mountain, Takuya Ridge. So all the San Emilio Mountains back here. This tree is fairly common, especially kind of at those higher elevations in this area. And yeah, here's a really classic sort of almost pure Jeffrey pine forest. I think there's like one white fir you can see in this shot. But yeah, you can see those big plates of bark. Again, it's almost like armor, and that really helps protect them against fire for the most part. And you can see there's some evidence that fire had come through here at some point in the past. And this is on Mount Pinos, pretty high up. Now, the sugar pine, this is a species that you often see right alongside Jeffrey pine or Ponderosa pine, but it's really easy to tell apart from those species. It has, first of all, it has 5 needles in a bundle that right from the start narrows it down to either sugar pine or a limber pine. But yeah, 5 needles in a bundle. They have pretty short leaves as well. They have really long seed cones. They have these long, lanky limbs that sort of droop when they have cones at the end of them. That's where the cones occur, is right at the ends of the branches. You can find them in the southern Los Padres and also in the Monterey Ranger District. So yeah, relatively short leaves compared to all those other pines that I've mentioned. With the exception of limber pine. Limber pine also has really short leaves, but you don't see limber pine and sugar pine growing together in the Los Padres National Forest. It has I think the thing that makes it easy to distinguish it the most is the cones. They are really long. They're in fact the longest cones of any pine species on Earth. This is not even a very long cone, relatively speaking, for the species, but it kind of gives you a sense of what their cones look like. They do not stay closed on the tree. They open up and release their seeds. So yeah, cool species for that alone. You can really see these cones clustering at the ends of the branches. And so when they do have their cones out and they're kind of full of sap and resin, they're pretty heavy, and so they'll sort of make these branches droop. And so you can really see the difference between sugar pine here on the left and Jeffrey pine. Again, Jeffrey pine's got kind of that no branch, lower down on the trunk. It doesn't have a lot of branches, and so it's very top heavy. And you will see these long, lanky limbs that are full of cones at the ends of them on the sugar pine. And you can see that again here. the Jeffrey pine does not have, this is the other thing about Jeffrey pines is that they tend to have these clusters of leaves, these bundles of leaves. They tend to cluster at the ends of these smaller stems that can be kind of long. And so what I'm getting at is the limbs of the sugar pine seem like they're sort of covered in foliage all the way up the limb, whereas Jeffrey pines don't always look like that. You can see a lot more of the branches not being covered by foliage. So similar to Jeffrey pine, you can find sugar pine on Big Pine Mountain. You can find it. A great place to see it is on Pine Mountain Ridge, Alamo Mountain. You can see it there, and a little bit on Mount Pinos. You'll see this. You'll see them mainly on the south-facing slope. You won't really see it. I have not come across them in the San Emilio Mountains, and really haven't come across it in the north side of Mount Pinos, and I don't think I've come across any on Cerro Noroeste over here to the west. Best place by far to see sugar pine in the Los Padres is Pine Mountain Ridge. That's Mount Pinos in the background there, and Cerro Noroeste over here. But Pine Mountain Ridge, for sure, best place to see them. You'll see these huge stands of them where they're almost like the forest is dominated by sugar pine, which is somewhat rare. I mean, it's not something you see very often anywhere in California. So this is really cool. Alamo Mountain is a neat place to sort of put your knowledge of a lot of these pines to the test, because you'll see them sort of co-occurring. You'll see the Jeffrey pine, you'll see Ponderosa pine there, and the sugar pine. They all occur right next to each other, and you'll see white fir and Douglas fir, which Bigcone Douglas-fir, which I'm about to talk about. All of those are occurring in this one shot, and some hardwoods like black oak, which you can see down there. But before we get to white fir and Bigcone Douglas-fir, I've got to talk about this pine that really bucks all the trends that I just mentioned. It is an unusual pine, to say the least, but it is really common in the Mount Pinos Ranger District, and so it's pretty easy to find and to tell apart once you know what to look for. Again, it only has one leaf in a bundle. It has pretty small seed cones, the smallest of any pine in the Los Padres National Forest. And it's only in the southern Los Padres. So you will not see this up in the Monterey Ranger District. So here are those, it's got short, pretty sharp needles that, again, are not occurring with, they don't have more than one leaf in a bundle. You can really see those fascicles here. So it's still a bundle. It still has that membranous sheath. It just only has one leaf in it, which is unusual, to say the least. It's the only species in the world that does that. And they also tend to have forked trunks, kind of like the gray pine, but they're much shorter. They're often almost shrub-like. They're not very large trees, height from a height perspective. And then there are those small cones you can see down there. I don't know if I've got a zoomed in version of that, but yeah, forked trunk, short leaves. Yeah, here are the cones kind of zoomed in. So they're pretty small. They have really large seeds, the largest of any pine in the Los Padres. They do not have winged seeds, so they don't have little wing-like structures on the seeds, which is a little bit unusual for the pines in this area. And they are delicious. I haven't mentioned this yet, but when you eat pine nuts, like you get from the store, those actually do come from pine cones. I mean, a lot of people don't quite realize this. They are just from a different species across the Atlantic Ocean in the Mediterranean area. That's where a lot of those pine nuts come from. But you can eat all of the pine nuts that you find in the Los Padres. You can eat them; they are edible. And the biggest and probably tastiest are the single-leaf pinyon pine. You can see it here with those small cones and leaves. And you don't always see it covered in snow, but when you do, it's pretty cool. And so I've actually, this map is just showing where you can find this ecosystem called Pinyon Juniper Woodland, or it's sometimes thought of as a forest. And so this is where you will find single-leaf pinyon pine. Again, it's almost exclusively in the Mount Pinos Ranger District. You can find some populations of single-leaf pinyon pine along Highway 33, closer to Pine Mountain, which is interesting. Really good place to see it is the San Emilio Mesa, which is in the Chumash Wilderness in Ventura County. So this is kind of on the south slope, bottom slopes of Cerro Noroeste, close to Mount Pinos, that area. And you can find a lot of single-leaf pinyon pine in the Cuyama badlands here. This is an Apache Canyon, which is nearby. And the reason I wanted to show you this is a really classic sort of pinyon juniper woodland scene here. And so you can see the single leaf pinyon, that is what is dominating here. But you'll notice this kind of weird yellowish shrub that is growing among the pinyons. That is the juniper, which is where we get the name pinyon juniper woodland. This is the California juniper. It is our only juniper that's native to the Los Padres National Forest. It tends to be a shrub. It can be kind of a small tree sometimes, but this is how you usually see it. And it is in the cypress family, so it's very different from the pines. It is a conifer, but it has totally different leaf structures. It doesn't have needles. It has like these little scale-like leaves, and the cones, these are cones. They look more like berries on this species, and they smell like gin. It's a great species. It's a wonderful ecosystem to go and explore, but I'm not going to talk really in depth about that. So moving on with the pine family, we got white fir. This is the only true fir you will find in the southern Los Padres National Forest. And in fact, you will only find this particular species in the southern Los Padres, and you will almost, I would say always, you always find it along with Jeffrey pine or sugar pine, or Ponderosa pine in the Los Padres National Forest. Now, we do have one other true fir in the Los Padres National Forest, but it is extremely rare. It is considered the rarest fir on Earth. It is the Santa Lucia fir. It only grows up in this a couple little areas in the Monterey Ranger District, and it is a gorgeous species. You can see it's got these kind of, it's like a spire, sticking up. So it's got these really long, trunks that don't have long branches up towards the top. Beautiful species, has really cool cones. Just an interesting species, but I'm not going to get into it because it's so very rare, and I want to focus on these common species. White fir, on the other hand, you can see maybe why it's called white fir, especially the younger trees and younger parts of the trunks. They are very white. They have these flat, sort of blunt, short needles that are not bundled at all. And I don't often use the term needles when I'm not talking about pines. They're really, these are, let's just call these leaves. They're not needle-like at all. They do tend to stand up on the stem, which is one thing that helps really tell them apart from something like the Bigcone Douglas-fir or Douglas-fir in the area. There are some other interesting things, like they have that kind of grayish underside with this sort of green stripe that goes down the middle. All of these are useful things to tell apart white fir from Bigcone Douglas-fir, but it's very easy to tell apart from all those pines. They look nothing like the pines once you start to recognize these features. One of the things that really sets them apart from pretty much every other species of conifer in the Los Padres is that they have these big cones. They're not that big, but they're big enough to see. You can easily see them. They tend to be up at the top of the trees, and they stick straight up on the branches, and they actually don't fall. They don't open and then like stay open and whole and then fall down to the ground. What they do is they basically, as they open these like scales that have the seeds kind of at the ends of them, they sort of just fall off of the cone. And so it's sort of like it disintegrates while it's on the tree, and that's what releases the seeds. And you can see the remnants, almost like corn cobs left over from these cones, cone cobs. I don't think anyone calls them that, but maybe that's a way to remember them. They're still sticking straight up on the tree, but you can see that they've done their thing. They've sort of fallen apart and released their seeds. Very easy way to tell a white fir from other conifers in the area. Basically, the distribution in Los Padres National Forest is exactly the same as Jeffrey pine and Ponderosa pine. You will see it in Santa Barbara County in the Big Pine Mountain area. You'll see it on Pine Mountain, Alamo Mountain, all around Mount Pinos, Fraser Mountain, the San Emilio Mountains. Again, you always see it as part of the sort of mixed conifer forest where the other dominant species are Jeffrey pine, sugar pine. If you want to see some really, really nice white fir and some pretty large specimens, go to Pine Mountain Ridge. And this is a mountain that keeps coming up in terms of like where you should go and look for some of these species. This is a great place. You can see there's this one stand pretty early on the Reyes Peak Trail that is almost pure white fir. This is old growth. It has a lot of this wolf lichen on the bark, and you'll see these kind of older specimens tend to have this sort of grayish bark. Their bark is very furrowed. I'm going to show you what that looks like compared to some of the pines. The other thing that you'll see is that it has this mistletoe in it, especially up at the tops of the trees, called Bolian mistletoe. So this is very similar to the mistletoe that you will see in like oaks and sycamores. It's not the same species, but it looks a lot like it. In pines, you don't see this mistletoe. You see a different type of mistletoe called dwarf mistletoe, which looks completely different. And you can see this really this is a native species of mistletoe, by the way. So to tell it apart from the pines, I mean, you don't even have to really get that close to it. It has this almost, it's like a Christmas tree shape to it. It's probably what you think of when you think of something like a Christmas tree. In fact, it has been used as Christmas trees historically, not as much as the Douglas fir, which I think is even more commonly used as a Christmas tree. But if you compare it right next to these Jeffrey pines, I mean, you can see through the Jeffrey pine foliage. You really can't so easily with the white fir. You can also, if you can just tell, there's some that white bark on the younger. These are younger specimens here, so they kind of got that whitish bark. These are, of course, the white firs. And if you were to compare some species side by side, you could tell just by the bark, actually, which species is which. This is on Pine Mountain. So this is Jeffrey pine. Again, it's got the big plates of armor, and it's kind of got that reddish, orangish color to it. This is sugar pine over here. It is, it's obviously got pine bark. It's a little bit more, it's similar to Jeffrey pine, but doesn't have those big plates, and it doesn't have quite the same color. It tends to be a little bit more muted in its color. And then right in the middle, you've got this big white fir. So it's got that grayish furrowed bark on this older part of the tree. And you'll notice it's the only one that has all this this wolf lichen growing on it. And so we tend to see that, especially in places like Pine Mountain, where you have a lot of this wolf lichen. It tends to almost only grow on the bark of the white fir compared to these other species. Now, Bigcone Douglas-fir, not a true fir. Sometimes it's called bigcone spruce. It's not a spruce either. It is its own weird little genus called the Douglas firs, Pseudotsuga, which actually is an interesting scientific name. It basically means false hemlock, and this word right here, tsuga, is the Japanese word for hemlock. And so botanists early on kind of thought they were similar to the hemlocks, which are in this genus called tsuga. So they basically were like, they're pretty similar, but they're not exactly alike, and they're distinct enough. Let's sort of group them in their own genus. And mainly in the Los Padres National Forest, you will find bigcone Douglas fir. There is the true Douglas fir, which is like the state tree of Oregon, very common farther north. We do technically have it in the Los Padres, but is extremely hard to come across. It's pretty rare. But if you go just north, like to the Santa Cruz Mountains, you will start seeing a lot of true Douglas fir. Now they do have these woody cones that are kind of similar to pine cones, and they hang down on the branches, so they're not like firs at all. They don't have those cones that are sticking straight up, and they will fall to the ground whole like that. So you can find these easily on the ground. Again, unlike the true firs. And so this actually is something like if we had true spruces, that's where you would actually probably be more concerned about differentiating this from a spruce. But we don't have any true spruces in the Los Padres National Forest, so we don't have to worry about that. It is only in the southern Los Padres National Forest. This is the bigcone Douglas fir species. It's only in the southern Los Padres. It's really only in Santa Barbara County and Ventura County. And you'll see it on north-facing slopes and in these sort of steep canyons, basically these little isolated populations. And the foliage is pretty, it's quite lovely, and it smells wonderful. All of these have really lovely smelling leaves, but I really like the bigcone Douglas fir leaves. They do not stick straight up on the stem like the white fir, and they are otherwise somewhat similar to fir leaves, more similar to firs than to pines. They're not bundled. Yeah, I don't know what else to say. They're a little bit sharper. They're sharper than the white fir for sure. The easy way to tell it apart, though, from anything is just to look at its cones. So this is a developing cone, but you can see it's got these what we call bracts sticking out between the scales, and they look like mouse butts. I don't know what else to say. They look like little mice trying to kind of get in between the scales, and that's something that has been long remarked that they look like that by indigenous cultures for a very long time, and by others. So yeah, you can think of them as little mouse butt bracts, and that is an easy way to tell them apart. Now, if you had Bigcone Douglas-fir and a true Douglas-fir side by side, which you really don't, they don't co-occur next to each other. But if you did, the easy way to tell them apart would be its cone size. And so you can see why this is Bigcone Douglas-fir, why it's called big cone. It's not a very large cone, generally speaking, but relative to the Douglas-fir, it is a pretty large cone. It's about twice as large. So fun fact for you. But again, don't have to worry about trying to differentiate these species from each other because they don't occur next to each other. Now, what I will say is that from a distance, Bigcone Douglas-fir can look a little bit like the sugar pine. So this is a sugar pine over here, and so it's got those long, lanky branches with relatively short leaves. You sort of see that with Bigcone Douglas-fir. The big old specimens, you'll see that they have long, lanky branches with short leaves as well, but they don't have those long cones hanging at the ends of the branches. So that is one easy way to tell them apart. Also, the bark. This is Bigcone Douglas-fir here. This is the big ones. They're just crazy. They have really thick bark. They are the most fire-resistant tree in the southernmost Padres National Forest. They're pretty close to as being as fire resistant as a coast redwood. Both of them can resprout from their branches after being basically completely burned, but they have really thick, deeply furrowed bark, totally unlike the sugar pine. It just doesn't have bark that looks like this at all. And you can find it, it's got a wide distribution in Santa Barbara County and Ventura County, but again, it occurs in these scattered little populations that there's not a lot of them, but they are sort of widely dispersed. And so you can see them in the Sierra Madre Mountains, up in the Figueroa Mountain area, Big Pine Mountain, that area in the San Rafael Wilderness. You can see them a little bit in the Santa Barbara Front Country, but on the north-facing slopes of the San Ynez Mountains. You can see them closer to Ojai in these scattered populations. And then you will see them all the way over to Alamo Mountain, where they occur at lower elevations and on the north slopes of Pine Mountain Ridge. You can see them all along Highway 33, great place to see them. And there is even a little bit up in the Pine Mountain Club area, but not a lot. One of my favorite places to see this species, this is one of the very first trails I ever hiked in the Los Padres National Forest after moving out to California, the Davy Brown Trail on Figueroa Mountain. Boy, this is a beautiful stand of Bigcone Douglas-firs, really large specimens, just wonderful place to see them. All along State Route 33 in Ventura County, you will see these populations like on these north-facing slopes and in these canyons that you can see from the road. Just gorgeous place to see these, especially if you can see them with snow on them. Potrero John Canyon. So this is actually looking from Reyes Peak, I want to say, somewhere close to Reyes Peak, looking down into Potrero John Canyon. So State Route 33 is kind of snaking through. I think you can just see the road back there, but sort of snaking through the canyons back there. This is Potrero John coming up, and you'll see these are those stands of Bigcone Douglas-fir. This is what I mean when I say they're kind of scattered and they're on these north-facing slopes. In these canyons. That's what I'm talking about. And they tend to be surrounded by chaparral. So that was conifers, and that was a lot. I don't know how much time we've spent just on conifers, but let's try to move through hardwoods relatively quickly here. Hardwoods, quite different than conifers. Difference in wood characteristics, but they're also just in completely different families. They have different leaf structures. Everything about them is different. They're flowering plants. They're not gymnosperms. Lots of differences. But I want to focus on the oaks because it's such a big genus that has a lot of species in the Los Padres. You can find this in both the southern Los Padres and the Monterey Ranger District. It is evergreen. So when you see the word live, when we're talking about oaks, so coast live oak, canyon live oak, that just means that it is an evergreen species of oak. And evergreen, all those conifers I just mentioned, those are also evergreen. Evergreen does not mean that leaves never die and fall off the tree. It just means that it doesn't happen all at once in one time of the year. So this is opposed to deciduous trees, which do lose their leaves at kind of all at the same time in a particular time of year, usually in the fall. You just don't see that in these live oaks. They do lose their leaves do die, but they kind of are constantly dying and dropping here and there, but they tend to look green throughout the year. So these leaves on coast live oak, the leaves are the easiest way to tell this species apart from all the other oaks in the area. They have these really thick, waxy leaves. They tend to curl quite a bit. They are, they're not super large, but they're definitely not lobed. And if you look at the underside of the leaf, you will notice where these lateral veins meet this midrib vein here. You'll see these clusters of hairs. And so we kind of lovingly refer to these as hairy armpits. It's the only species of oak that has this in the area. So this is a really easy way to tell them apart from other species. And yeah, another cool thing, you'll notice these lateral veins, they kind of stick out past the leaf margins. That's what gives the leaves these little teeth on the margins. They're not serrated, but they have little sort of sparse teeth, and that's because of these veins, which is interesting. Like all oaks, they have flowers, these male flowers called catkins that sort of dangle. They're wind pollinated, so they don't have maybe some of the classic flower structures that you think of because they're not trying to attract pollinators necessarily. They're just trying to get pollen out there and get it dispersed on the wind. They tend to be yellow, but you can sometimes see them. They're a little bit reddish. They're acorns. So acorns can be a useful way to tell different oak species apart. And the way that you really use acorns to tell things apart is whether or not the acorn cap is what we call tubercled, but we'll just use the term bumpy. If they're bumpy or if they're more flat scale-like, that is how you really tell some of these oak species apart. And so on coast live oaks, they are flat and scale-like. They're not bumpy. And coast live oaks, you tend to see, as you might imagine, close to the coast. They can be sort of pure like oak woodlands where they're dominating, or they can be scattered among chaparral, which is what you see here in the Santa Barbara front country. And I don't have maps for a lot of these. So where you find coast live oak is mostly in the coastal mountains, but you can see it all through the Los Padres National Forest in like in the southern Los Padres and the Monterey Ranger District, but you've got to be in the San Ynez Mountains, up by Slow, up in the Cuesta Ridge area, Lopez Canyon. Like that's where you'll see coast live oak mostly is again closer to the coast. As you go inland, you start getting into other oak species. Like blue oak, for example. This is one you won't see right next to the coast. You will see it farther inland. It's quite a different species of oak. They tend to be in these oak woodlands like this that are fairly open and have these grassy understories. Unfortunately, this is all non-native grass for the most part. Historically, before colonization, you would have seen more native grasses and herbaceous plants. This is what we have now in a lot of places, but we do have these blue oaks. They're beautiful, beautiful trees. You'll often see these big American mistletoe in them. You'll see this in most oak species. You'll see mistletoe of some sort. And one thing though that really sets it apart from something like coast live oak is that it is deciduous. And so these leaves, and you can see this, they're just starting to have that color fade and start to die a little bit, but they are deciduous, so they will lose their leaves in the late summer, fall, and that sort of the driest time of the year. And their leaves are very small. They've got this kind of bluish color to them. They're not like this dark green, and they are not really lobed at all, and they don't have like sharp teeth along the margins. So that's one way to tell them apart from something like valley oak, which is something you will see sometimes co-occurring with blue oak, but usually more like down in these valleys, not so much on the slopes. And they have much more lobed leaves. They're also pretty small leaves, but they have a different color. They're darker green. They're lobed, which is why it's called Quercus lobata. So they're a little bit more similar to something you might see in terms of oaks out east of the Rocky Mountains. And where you can find blue oak is up here in the Figaro Mountain area. You can find some stands of blue oak, which is pretty cool. But where it really shines is in the La Panza range, up here in sort of southern San Luis Obispo County, and in the Sierra Madre Mountains here. One of my favorite places to see it is Figaro Mountain, where you can see it. This is, again, it's kind of, it's deciduous, right? So it is starting to, those leaves are changing color. It's kind of this gorgeous orangish color. And they are growing as part of, that's really oak woodland kind of right there, but you'll see sort of this larger landscape context. It's kind of this gray pine, blue oak dominated ecosystem. It's often called foothill blue oak, pine woodland, or foothill pine oak woodland. There's different names for it, but you will see them occurring together. And yes, these are gray pines, blue oaks. Willow Spring Trail. This is off of State Route, or Highway 166 on the south side of it as it goes through the Los Padres National Forest. Great place to see blue oaks. And you should go through the blue oak woodlands on your see them on your way to seeing red shanks, this is one of the best trails to see this really cool species of shrub / small tree called red shanks, which is similar to chamise, if you know that species. Cool place to see it. Now, canyon live oak, again, we see live. It is an evergreen oak. Kind of similar in some ways to the coast live oak, but it's more inland. It tends to be in these canyons. You often see it with Bigcone Douglas-fir. Its leaves are different. They are a little waxy, but they don't tend to have that curl to them. They don't have the hairy armpits. A lot of variability here with the leaf shape and structure. So you'll see even on the same branch, some of these leaves have these little sharp teeth, some of them don't. It can be kind of confusing. They're the only species of this list that has this particular gall called the mushroom gall. This is basically almost like a benign tumor that's induced by, it's formed by the plant, but in response to this little tiny native wasp species. So there's a little wasp growing in there. It's pretty cool. They tend to have bumpy caps, but they also cannot have the bumpy caps, so that's not the most useful way to tell them apart from other species. I will say, though, they have really massive acorns. I believe the largest of any of our native oaks here. These acorns are absolutely huge, so that should help with telling them apart. This is a cool canyon live oak woodland that you see in the upper reaches of Potrero John Canyon. So if you hike up that trail and you keep going past where the trail ends and kind of stick to the creek, you will eventually come across these really large canyon live oaks that are pretty cool. Now, I will say canyon live oak often occurs as this understory species in conifer forest at those higher elevations, like on Pine Mountain. Great place to see canyon oak growing right next to pines like Jeffrey pine. However, there's another species that also grows as an understory sort of species of oak in pine forest or conifer forest. And that's really the only place that you'll see this particular species. That's black oak. So let's talk about black oak a little bit. Very different. It is not evergreen. It is deciduous, so it will lose its leaves in the fall, and it turns this absolutely stunning color, this orange color. But again, you see it's surrounded by pines here. This is always how you're going to see black oak, as this sort of understory oak species. Sometimes it is kind of in the overstory, and it's sort of co-dominating. I'll show you a photo of that in a minute. But its leaves, they're the only leaves like it among the oaks that are native to the Los Padres. They really look like something you would see out east. have this classic oak leaf shape that people from east of the Rocky Mountains would be familiar with. And yeah, they turn a lovely color in the fall. And this is where you can see they can be quite large, and so they can be kind of co-dominant in the overstory of these mixed conifer forests or the Jeffrey pine forest. One thing about a lot of these oaks, especially coast live oak, canyon live oak, and black oak, is that they are able to resprout after fire. And so this is a black oak that was top killed in a wildfire. I don't know, 15 years before I took this photo, I think. And so the oak actually survived. Its above ground biomass was killed. It's still mostly still there, but it's not growing new growth on these branches of the trunk. But it did resprout from its base. So it's the same root system, the same oak, which is pretty cool. Now, where you see this is interesting. So you will see it on Alamo Mountain, Mount Pinos, kind of going towards like Thorn Meadows, Thorn Point, that area. But you won't see it on Pine Mountain. That's where you'll see canyon live oak sort of filling that niche of being in the understory of those conifer forests. You can see it over on the Mission Pine Ridge area, Mission Pine Basin. You will see some black oak over there as well. But there's not, it's not super widely distributed. Best place, in my opinion, to see it is Alamo Mountain. It's just because there's some really large black oaks here. It tends to be almost co-dominant with the Jeffrey pines and in a lot of places, but it's just gorgeous during the fall when it's turning this color. So that's a great place to see it. Now, you can also see black oak on Mount Pinos, very easy place to see black oak, and probably easier to see it there than to try to find your way out to Alamo Mountain. Some other hardwoods I want to mention: Pacific Madrone. It is in the same family as manzanitas, so it may look a little bit like a manzanita, but they are truly trees. They don't really occur as shrubs like most manzanitas do, but they do have that peely bark. They're a lot more orange than manzanitas. Really gorgeous species. It almost feels like tropical in some ways. It's got these big evergreen leaves, really, really large leaves, very lush foliage. And this orange sort of bark, smooth bark, is what I think easily gives it away as a madrone. However, you will see on the older parts of the tree, especially down at the base of the trunk, you will see some actual bark, gray bark that it sort of persists on the tree. But for the most of these trees, most of the bark is actually this sort of smooth, peely bark that peels each year. They have very similar flowers to manzanitas. And you will notice their fruits may remind you of something like a strawberry tree, which is not native to North America, but is often planted in cities in the area here. And it's in the same genus as Madrone. Madrone, this is the only member of this genus that we have in North America, to my knowledge. And it's certainly the only one in that genus in the Los Padres National Forest. And so it's got these big, really cool fruits. They're not that big, but they got that sort of same vibe as the strawberry tree fruits that are edible. I think Madrone fruits are edible, but I'd have to double check on that. Great place to see it, Romero Camusa Road, kind of going toward, like if you were trying to get to Blue Canyon in the Santa Barbara area. So this would be like on the north-facing slope of the San Ynez Mountains. You can actually see like almost like whole stands of Pacific Madrone, which is pretty unusual. Usually you sort of see them scattered around. But yeah, they tend to be really close to the coast, and I tend to see them like on the tops of these ridges and on the north-facing slopes. So the only places that you can really see it: north-facing slope, top of San Ynez Mountains, but also on Cuesta Ridge, you'll see it there, and much more common up in the Monterey Ranger District. So really easy to see up there. California Bay Laurel is a tree that you may see kind of growing right next to some of these madrones. Another evergreen hardwood. It's in the same family as avocados, which is interesting. And it is really easy to identify. It's bay leaves, right? Like the bay leaves you cook with. That's from a different but very closely related species. That's not, that's from across the Atlantic. But yeah, it's got these big, smooth, elongated leaves that don't have any serration on the margins, no teeth on the margins. They have these little tiny yellow flowers that are blooming, February, March, that time of year. And then their fruits, they almost look like little avocados starting to form. And then they have this big kind of like a pit in the middle that is actually edible. If you roast it, you can make like a chocolate-like substance out of it. It's really cool. So people call those bay nuts. And you'll see, if you look at the right time of year below these bay laurels, you'll see like huge piles of these fruits that have fallen and kind of dried. This is actually a really good time to harvest them if you wanted to try cooking those bay nuts, because it's really easy to take this dried flesh off, which you don't need the flesh. You just want that pit on the inside, which is kind of the opposite of what you do with avocados, right? So that's interesting. Yeah, there are those fruits a little more zoomed in here. So yeah, pretty cool tree. It's very, very fragrant. The leaves, especially the fresh leaves, smell really good. You can cook with them just like you would cook with bay leaf from the store. It's about twice as strong though, so you want to use like half as much as you would normally use. When you're looking at these lower parts of the tree, especially on the younger trees, you'll see this kind of smooth, almost whitish bark in some cases. But it does have more like grayish kind of traditional bark as it gets older. Really cool thing about bay laurel, it can resprout after fire, and it is one of the most prolific resprouters that I know of. This is my partner Gabby. She's standing next to some really wonderful specimens here. This is just a few years after the Whittier fire burned in the San Ynez Mountains, and so they have put out like 20 feet of growth from their base. After the fire. So they didn't die in the fire. Their above ground biomass was killed. Again, the trunks are still mostly there, but they're resprouting from this sort of big burl that's kind of half buried at their base. So that's pretty cool. Where you find bay laurel, you can find it a little bit more inland than the Madrone, but San Ynez Mountains is a great place. You can find it all around Ojai in the mountains there. Even up towards the Figueroa Mountain area, you will find some bay laurel there. And Cuesta Ridge is a great place to see it. And then if you go all the way up to the Monterey Ranger District, very easy to find there. And the Western sycamore. So this is one of the species that you pretty much exclusively find near creeks. It is deciduous. You can see that here. This is in the fall, it's starting to lose its leaves. And right behind me is a very large creek. And so we're on a floodplain here. That's where you tend to see them. They have this white bark, kind of peely bark, helps really set it apart from a lot of other species. Their leaves, they look like dinosaur footprints to me. Take that for what it's worth. Hopefully that helps you identify them. They're very large leaves, and yeah, if you look up dinosaur footprint, I think they look kind of similar. And you will see American mistletoe, just like I think it's American mistletoe, one of the mistletoes. So you'll see it just like you would see in oaks and some other hardwoods. So especially when it's deciduous, or when it's lost all of its leaves, the mistletoe is the main source of kind of green that you'll see up in these trees, which is pretty cool. And they're fruits, little spiky balls of these seeds that have a bunch of hairs on them. They're really weird. If you ever opened a cattail seed head, it's kind of similar. The inside, it's like very puffy, and it sort of explodes with all these little tiny seeds that are kind of furry. And so you'll see these dangling spiky fruits on sycamores, which helps set them apart. Cottonwoods, another species that you will, we have a couple species, and you will only see these along creeks. You'll especially see them more inland, and they will be like the dominant tree in the whole area because it's mostly chaparral, but then right next to the creek, you'll see a bunch of these cottonwoods. They, as you can tell, are deciduous. They lose their leaves in the fall, right after turning this brilliant yellow color. Just gorgeous. And it's like during this time of year, you could fly around and you could draw the creeks very easily just by looking at where you see all these yellow cottonwoods. We have two species. I wouldn't worry too much about trying to tell them apart. They're very, very similar. Their leaf shape is different enough that it is not that hard to tell them apart. The Fremont cottonwood, it has this sort of flat base of the leaf. It's what we call a deltoid shape compared to the black cottonwood. The Fremont cottonwood also has, if you look at the margin, these are not serrated margins. It's what we call scalloped margins. So they're like little humps. Those are much more prominent. They're larger on the Fremont cottonwood than on the black cottonwood. These are, the scallops are, it almost looks like very fine serration. Really thick furrowed bark that tends to be kind of whitish grayish. And it's just an easy way to tell them apart from something like sycamore, which you may see growing in the same spot, or white alder, which I'll talk about in a second. Very, very different. This is a red-breasted sapsucker. They like these riparian woodlands, and so this is a cool native bird species on this tree. Cool place to see it is Red Rock Canyon. So this is on the trail, really close to Red Rock Pool, the place where people swim. And so yeah, you can spot the San Ynez River just by, again, where these cottonwoods are growing. Now you will see white alder often growing right alongside cottonwoods. Totally different tree, and basically everything about it is different. It's got this smooth kind of grayish bark. It's not always this smooth, but especially on these smaller trunks, these younger trunks, you'll see it's pretty smooth. One thing that I think is pretty cool about this is they've got these like eyes where they're old. These are where old branches were and have since broken and fallen off. So they've got these eyes that kind of spiral around the tree. You'll always see this next to creeks. It's got these leaves that have these really prominent veins on both sides of the leaf, especially on the top side. They're kind of sort of almost like serrated. And they've got catkins kind of like oaks. So these are the male flowers. And then these are the cones, the fruits, but they look like little cones. So they actually kind of become woody when they're sort of done doing their thing. So if you see, obviously a hardwood, this broadleaf tree, and it's got little tiny cones on it, it's an alder. It's the only tree that's like that. So yeah, which sets it apart for sure. And yeah, again, long male flowers, prominent leaf veins, cone-like fruits. It's a white alder. Lastly, I want to just mention the big leaf maple. This is a gorgeous tree species. It has a huge leaf, as you can imagine. It's our only maple that is native to the Los Padres. It is identifiable, I think, just by the leaf alone. It's the only one that has this maple-like leaf. The only thing that you might get confused with is a sycamore, but again, just think of Canada, right? Like think of the maple leaf symbol. That's what these big leaf maples tend to look more like. They have seeds. They have these yellow flowers. If you can catch them, they tend to not stick around for too terribly long. But those will give way to these really cool little like helicopter seeds, right? If you drop one, they'll kind of like twirl as they fall slowly to the ground, which is pretty cool. And that is it. Those are the main trees I wanted to cover for the Los Padres National Forest. We have gone through a lot. We still have not even gotten through probably half of the species of trees that are native to the Los Padres National Forest. But these are, I think, some of the most common ones and the ones that are easiest to learn to identify and the ones that you'll really see as you're out hiking. And so hopefully you have learned some new tips and tricks for identifying tree species that you can put to the test, and you can impress your friends or impress yourself with this knowledge going forward. Thank you for watching. And I just want to say, lastly, you can find some links below in the description of this video, some links like to our store where you can see all of our wonderful books on trees. And you can also find a link to donate to Los Padres Forest Watch. We can't do this without your support, without donations from people like you who are watching right now. So if you like this webinar and you want to see more of this type of educational information, please consider making a donation so that we can do more of this in the future. Thanks again for watching. Have a wonderful day.